if the dollar becomes an international policeman of trade, then people will look to try and move away from it. Donald Trump only ever has overreactions. He basically runs policy through social media postings, generally in capitalized letters. The threat of a BRICS currency is very low. It's not a natural grouping of countries. Russia is basically a petrol station with nuclear weapons.
Donald Trump threatening countries with tariffs is a common tactic these days, but eyebrows are now being raised from Beijing to Moscow at the threat of 100% tariffs if these countries do not bow to his demands. Let's get into what's raising the T word with Mr. Trump with Fraser Howie. He's an independent China analyst. Fraser, thanks for joining us. So, First off, tell us, what countries are we talking about here, and why is Mr. Trump threatening them with tariffs?
Well, his most recent post, I wouldn't dare call it a policy, is towards the BRICS countries, which originally are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's increased actually to 9 countries, and that was the latest post talking about tariffs there if they try and move away from the dollar and trade more amongst themselves, either using potentially a BRICS currency or perhaps the renminbi. And so this is yet another threat from Trump, which of course is his preferred means of policy making.
So you touched on this, but that was exactly my next question. Are we talking about a brand new currency here, or something akin to the euro going into effect about 20 years ago, or more of an assumption that one of the BRICS nations' currencies would become the main mode of trade?
Look, that's a very good question. And the trouble is that these are just sort of ambitions, and maybe even that's aspirations, may be the better word, of some within the BRICS grouping. China, particularly China, has long worried not about putting the renminbi in the top slot, but about reducing its dependency on the dollar. They've seen how Russia has been targeted with dollar sanctions and freezing of dollar assets. They're extremely worried about such a scenario as well. So China in particular has been driving to try and create a sort of a non-dollar world, either increasing the trade in renminbi, and with the BRICS grouping, they're looking at that to be like a sort of a new G7, as it were, and hopefully, and they're hoping that potentially those countries can trade with their own currency. But frankly, it's very unlikely to happen. There's little buy-in from the other countries. The grouping itself is a pretty disparate group of countries. And so what they actually are talking about as a BRICS country, it's not clear, but we know that Trump is all for tariffs, and these countries are very much in his sights because a number of them run deficits with America.
We've been talking about it, but here's what Mr. Trump wrote on social media. The idea that the BRICS countries are trying to move away from the dollar while we stand by and watch is over. We require a commitment from these countries that they will neither create a new BRICS currency nor back any other currency to replace the mighty US dollar, or they will face 100% tariffs and should expect to say goodbye to selling into the wonderful US economy. You mentioned that these countries have disparate views on this, but what would be the upside for these nations if they did create or turn to a different currency?
Well, the trouble is it's not clear what the BRICS currency would actually look like. The Russian currency, the Indian rupee, and the Chinese renminbi, they're all restricted currencies. They're not freely tradable. They have closed capital accounts. And so from that perspective, what if they even were to come up with some sort of currency, it's not even clear what it would look like. It certainly wouldn't be freely tradable in the way that the euro is, or the dollar is, the yen is, or sterling is. But those countries also have their own currencies. So the idea that somehow they shouldn't be using even their own currency for trade doesn't really make much sense as well. It also highlights that Trump doesn't really understand the burden that the dollar is on the American economy, that the fact that it must be the bank of last resort to the world, and that it must run deficits to provide the dollar reserve status. And so this is classic Trump of mixing politics with economics with threats and not really understanding any of them. But like I said, I think recently, this is one of his, I haven't heard any other posts about BRICS from Trump. And so I think maybe someone's spoken to him recently about this, and he's just shot something off as, again, a broadside across these countries.
there has been response from some of these countries about this threat, this social media post. Here's how Vladimir Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, responded to this threat from Trump. Quote, if the United States uses force, as they say, economic influence to force countries to use the dollar, well, it will probably further strengthen these trends in the transition to national currencies. So, Fraser, could this actually backfire on the U.S.?
Look, I think I was, as a rule of thumb, I would never agree with Dmitry Peskov, but there is certainly a problem here, and a growing problem, that if America tries to weaponize the dollar too much, and there's clearly at times need for sanctions and restrictions and moves against bad actors, but if the dollar becomes sort of an international policeman of trade, then people will look to try and move away from it. One of the benefits of the dollar is how freely tradable it is, how available it is. Every bank will accept dollars. Every bank will lend dollars if they can. Anywhere you go in the world, people will accept dollars for transactions because it's so freely tradable. It's literally like it's the financial air we breathe. And if America continues to weaponize it and use it as a way to sort of try and threaten or cajole people, then it will have a perverse effect of people moving away from the dollar. Although the financial infrastructure of the world means it's extremely hard for anything to replace the dollar, but weaponization of the dollar is not in America's interests.
A question that came to mind for me as I was starting to come to understand the story is, why do this now? You know, Trump loves a tariff. He loves an economic punishment. This idea was floated recently by the Russian president. It does have some support from Brazil, but wouldn't President Biden have been an easier U.S. leader to deal with when it comes to the BRICS taking standing a little stronger on their own?
Yeah, the trouble is, though, that BRICS is a pretty artificial construct. You know, when Jim O'Neill and the team at Goldman Sachs came up with the idea, it had limited value as an investment thesis. Ultimately, it was basically the four biggest emerging markets economies. And for a time, it sort of worked. But they are very disparate economies. And clearly, it's hugely influenced and overawed by China, the sheer size. So BRICS as a functioning economic body, as a joint body, doesn't really make that much sense. And the idea of a joint currency, while it's being floated and talked about, is actually getting very little traction. The idea that the Indians and the Chinese would use a common currency really seems to defy belief. You can certainly see how Russia and China could want to be closer together, and are indeed closer together. But what's happening there is that the Russians are having to accept renminbi and use renminbi to trade, because literally the Chinese are one of the few countries that will deal with them in size.
Yeah, I've also been reading that there does seem to be very little traction, very little enthusiasm for this plan, which was proposed by Russia. So that begs the question, is this threat or this social media post an overreaction from Mr. Trump?
Sorry, I think Donald Trump only ever has overreactions. I think this is how he does things. He basically runs policy through social media postings, generally in capitalized letters. And so, look, the threat of a BRICS currency is very low. I think, though, the takeaway is that if you feel that dollar is going to be weaponized, many actors will start to say, hey, look, how do we reduce the dependency on the dollar? So it will backfire to some extent, but this seems to be classic Trump. And as I say, this is a post, not a policy. There's going to be lots of other policies that are coming down the road which are going to cause more problems than this.
You mentioned dollar dependency, and the dollar is a massive part of foreign exchange reserves. Let's take a look at this graphic comparing it to other currencies. As we can see, the dollar far outpaces even the euro, the ruble not even making our list here. But Fraser, with Mr. Trump coming back to the White House, do you think that countries are, possibly not just the BRIC nations, but many countries are looking to not put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak?
I'm sure they would like to diversify, and I think it makes sense to diversify. Anytime you're making an investment portfolio, you want to diversify. The trouble is the entire financial system of the world is largely geared around the dollar. And the fact that the dollar continues to run deficits because ultimately the excess savings of the rest of the world go into dollar assets. So you have this, you need to change the entire financial infrastructure to really reduce dependency on the dollar. And you need to take on this burden of running continual deficits to fund to basically provide assets for foreigners to buy. China's not prepared to do that. Russia's certainly in no position to do that. Neither is India, nor any of the other small BRICS countries. So we're not moving away from the dollar anytime soon. It isn't just a choice of shall we use the dollar or shall we use something else. The very financial infrastructure of how the financial system is built currently is based around the dollar, and that isn't changing anytime soon.
Let's quickly take a closer look at the BRICS group here, which until quite recently included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Let's look at how it stacks up against the G7. Since 1995, there's been a massive rise from the BRICS nations, bolstered massively by China. Those 5 countries now have a larger share of global GDP than the G7, as you can see from this graphic. Fraser, how did this happen? Is it just China and India holding up the rest? Though, of course, looking at that, you could also say that the U.S. is is definitely a heavyweight in the G7 as well.
Sure. Look, obviously, the rise of China and now the coming rise of India has bolstered those numbers. But I think it's a mistake also, sure, to simply look at the BRICS and sort of do those like-for-like comparisons, although you could argue the same is true of the G7. But you're simply just adding disparate numbers together. Yes, they're all GDPs. Yes, they all add up to a sum total. But these economies are not particularly linked in many ways. They're not necessarily complementary. There's sort of a hodgepodge of numbers of countries coming together. And as I said at the beginning, the BRICS is a term that was coined by Goldman Sachs as an investment thesis. Okay, it's not a natural grouping of countries. And some of the countries are highly dependent on particular commodities. Clearly, Brazil is very much a commodity provider. Russia is basically a petrol station with nuclear weapons. And that's not a model for long-term growth for either Russia or as a lead member of BRICS. So it's as I say, it's a pretty disparate group of nations. Not to say that the G7 are fully aligned, but it's so weighted towards China that the BRICS can do nothing without it being seen as a China vehicle.
Speaking of Russia, the ruble hit a 2-year low recently. What does that mean for this threat or this idea from Russia and the rest of the BRICS that they should move to another currency?
Well, like I say, I think politically they would like to do that. They would like to reduce that dependency. But the trouble is the Russian currency is clearly under pressure. And we must remember as well that simply you can't trade the Russian currency. The Russian banking system has largely been cut off from the rest of the world. Your ability to go and buy and sell rubles is very limited. This is an economy that's effectively will function as a war economy to continue to prosecute the war in Ukraine. And so, like I say, this is not a country that is anyway providing an economic model forward, either for BRICS or for anyone who wants to move away from the dollar.
Trump has also said recently he wants to impose sanctions on Canada and Mexico. At a certain point, it really does beg the question, who's even going to be left to sell things to the United States?
That's a good question. It also seems incredible that Trump, of course, came into power last time, tore up NAFTA, had a hissy fit about that, basically redid the structure called a USMCA, and he's now coming back into power and still blaming Canada and Mexico. This, though, is, I say, classic Trump. If there's something he has been consistent about through his public life and pronouncements, it's he dislikes or he likes tariffs. And he doesn't understand how economics works, how deficits works. But you're right, there is nobody who is out of the crosshairs. Everyone can sell to America, but only if they pay the tariffs. And of course, they're not paying the tariffs. It's the U.S. consumers and the importers who are paying the tariffs. So Trump's this is his hobby horse. Everything he believes can be solved by tariffs, but fundamentally it won't be.
Fraser Howie, independent China analyst. Thanks for joining us from Edinburgh.
Thank you very much.